Tonight, we're going to take a look at the role of the Central Intelligence Agency in sponsoring false flag operations. In particular, we will be examining Operation Gladio, a Cold War-era black op orchestrated by the CIA, who launched terrorist attacks in Italy and throughout Europe in order to blame leftist communists. The chosen targets were usually public places in order to create maximum impact. Bombs were planted in banks, in railway stations and trains, and snipers fired at will into innocent crowds of peaceful protesters or weekend shoppers simply out buying groceries. It was a slaughter of the innocents, and the United States, working through the CIA and secret war departments of NATO, carried out a long series of false flag terror attacks throughout the European continent to meet its own political ends. And with us now to help break this all down is a proficient expert in Operation Gladio, Richard Cottrell. He is a veteran European television journalist who specializes in politics and economics. He is a regular contributor to the national ITV network and the author of Gladio, NATO's dagger at the heart of Europe, the Pentagon, Nazi Mafia Terror Axis. And he joins us now from just outside of Venice, Italy. Richard Cottrell, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much indeed.
Hey, right out of the gate, let's start out with the evidence that we have that supports that Operation Gladio actually existed, because unfortunately in America, a lot of people are going to take one glimpse at Gladio and immediately dismiss it as a crazy conspiracy theory. So what kind of evidence do we have that supports that Gladio did indeed exist?
Well, solid and documentary evidence, actually. First of all, we must explain that the secret army units, which became known as Gladio, took their title from a secret army unit which was established in Italy. All these organizations were set up by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the original idea was that these would be sleeping soldiers who, in the event of a Soviet invasion of Western Europe, would lurk behind, nourished by secret arms dumps where they could cause havoc among the invading Soviet troops. This was an idea of Churchill's, actually, which dates a long way back to the Boer War, which he covered as a correspondent for London newspapers. But it was revived both during the war and after the war as a way of resisting invaders from the East. So we know perfectly well from many books, other than those written by me, that the Gladio secret army organizations were real, that they were established by NATO with the encouragement of Western intelligence agencies, including, as you just mentioned, the CIA, but also the intelligence agencies of every single member state of NATO, and even some countries which were not members of NATO, such as Switzerland and Sweden, who were actually ghost members of the alliance. And that's another story in itself. So there's no real dispute that these organizations existed. What actually happened was a warp in their activities. There was a problem because the United States of America, particularly supported by the United Kingdom and some other countries, wanted the Cold War to continue. They wanted to create the mirage of a terrorist threat inspired by Moscow in Western Europe in order to justify massive arms spending. And you won't have to look very far beyond the American military-industrial complex.
Well, I was just going to say, this reminds me of Ike's farewell address to the nation, where he warned of the impending military-industrial complex. So do you think this was a direct result of that? Because it looks like it started out with good intentions. I mean, I see nothing wrong with, leave behind NATO's stay-behind armies in case of a total invasion by the Soviet Union. So where did they go wrong? Was it the infiltration by the CIA and the military-industrial complex? Is that where it started to go south?
I think you've got to ask yourself a question here about General Lyman Lemnitzer. Lemnitzer, the author of the famous Northwoods Project, was fired by Kennedy, effectively sacked. Because, as I state in my book, he looked as though he was sailing pretty close to creating a military coup in Washington to overthrow the government. So Kennedy decided on a constructive dismissal. It was Lemnitzer more than any other figure who was responsible for warping the NATO secret armies into instruments of terror performed against civilians, not against Russian invaders, not against any form of military personnel, but just civilian citizens themselves, walking about the streets, minding their own business, catching trains, drinking beer in the beer fest, whatever. All of this flowed from the warped mind of possibly the biggest psychopath who's ever ruled over the kingdom of the Pentagon.
Well, and I agree with you, and I think it's important that whenever we discuss Operation Gladio, we have to discuss Operation Northwoods as well, yes, because they're both false flag events. One of them was, Northwoods being a proposed false flag event, but they both have been completely ignored by the mainstream media. I'm going to be labeled as a conspiracy theorist just for bringing it up, but Northwoods, like Gladio, cannot be denied because the Northwoods document is a live, living, breathing document that exists in the National Security Archive, and it reveals that in 1962, the U.S. Department of Defense signed off on a covert plan to stage terrorist attacks on American soil and blame Cuba. So tell us more about Operation Northwoods for those who might not be familiar with it.
Well, this was March 1962 when Lemnitzer, who wrote the document, sent it to Kennedy's office, actually, with the idea that the Pentagon could stimulate an artificial war against Cuba. In order to do this, he required some kind of sense of alarm, an emergency within the United States itself. So he cooked up the idea of hiring crooks and hoodlums to shoot at Americans going about their everyday business, blow up airliners, attack ships, and generally create the atmosphere of a communist attempt to disturb the peace and serenity of the United States of America. Now, this happened in March 1962. When General Lyman Lemnitzer got to NATO as Supreme Allied Commander, which was a demotion for him, and a monstrous insult to his huge personality, he exactly followed the Northwoods program. He transferred it exactly to Europe, and then began what is known in this country as the Anni di Piombo, or more widely, the Years of Lead, which tortured European citizens for the next 20 years. And it was simply a rerun of the Cuban fiasco. In order to justify an invasion of Cuba, he would create terror in the United States. In order to create the unrealistic nonsense of a Russian attempt to invade Europe, he created the machinery which would create mayhem among European citizens and convince them that the Reds were just under the bed. This was the same game. There was no difference. They were a horse and carriage out of the same stable.
Well, I mean, this guy should be known historically as someone every bit as evil as Osama bin Laden, but, he
had a khaki uniform on that makes a difference.
Absolutely. And I'm curious is how did Lemnitzer go from Northwoods, which was rejected in America, to Operation Gladio, which was implemented throughout Europe?
Well, a couple of things happened here, which are of great importance. JFK, a person I greatly admire, and I certainly confess that freely. I think he was one of the greatest statesmen that America has ever produced.
Well, I agree with you there.
And now, Kennedy was extremely intelligent, and from the moment he came to office, he realized that Lemnitzer was dangerous. He was one of the very few who did. He realized that the Pentagon was out of control. I mean, Arthur Schlesinger has long since said, when he was asked, during the Kennedy years, what was your biggest problem? And he said, we weren't in control of the Joint
Chiefs. Yep.
Yeah, and the Joint Chiefs were headed by Lyman Lemnitzer. There were a couple of books written about that time, which indicated the idea was present in media minds that there were dirty tricks going on in the Pentagon, and there might be a plot to overthrow the the JFK presidency, and possibly go beyond that.
Well, I know. I was just going to say, you're the only author, and I'm sorry to cut you off, but you're the only author that I know of so far that suspects Lyman Lemnitzer may have some sort of connection to the JFK assassination, and I think for good reason. I mean, he certainly had the motive, and he fits the profile. What do you think his connection is to the JFK assassination?
I think he organized it.
Wow.
I think he was the mastermind of the entire operation. There's a little bit of interesting background about this. The Pentagon and the CIA had a bad falling out over Zapata, sometimes known as the Bay of Pigs, inaccurately. Lemnitzer displayed his traditional attitude of playing one side against the other. He had fallen out with the CIA for all kinds of reasons, stretching back to Vietnam, and he encouraged them to go into the swamp with the nasty crocodiles and other reptilian creatures waiting for them, so that he could cut the CIA down to size. But then, as soon as he realized that he himself was in difficulty with Kennedy, he patched up the quarrel. And the CIA and the Pentagon, led by Lemnitzer, cooked up the plot to kill Kennedy. I have no doubt of this, and I state it quite clearly in my book. I'm the only person, you correctly say, ever to point this out. But my question is, why has nobody else ever pointed out? This was a man who suffered the huge humiliation of being sacked as the U.S. General Chief of Staff. He was denied his due second term of office. Never happened before. This was a very arrogant and proud man. He was raised to the pinnacles of military success by Eisenhower himself. He owed his entire rise in military circles entirely to the benevolence of Eisenhower. To outrage this man, who considered Kennedy to be not a communist, but certainly a communist sympathizer, was asking for trouble. This was a man who was going to hire hoodlums and criminals to shoot Americans in the street. Who killed Kennedy in Dallas that day? Hoodlums and criminals. Exactly the kind of people that the Pentagon and the CIA has continually worked with over the years.
Well, I agree with you, and Northwoods and Gladio clearly demonstrate his total lack of morality. I mean, he routinely hired the mafia to reach, you know, his objectives. He planned to unleash terror attacks, as you were saying, inside the United States. So he was going to kill innocent civilians so he could have his way with Cuba, an act that probably would have launched the U.S. into World War III with Russia. So who knows how far that would have gone. And look, this guy hired and worked with Nazi war criminals. He orchestrated the assassinations of political leaders, helped install ruthless dictators, you name it. So I guess it's safe to say that he was purely capable of murdering the president.
Well, he tried very hard to murder the president of France, General Charles de Gaulle, on at least 7 occasions. Some of these predated his appointment as Supreme Commander of Allied Forces Europe. But thereafter, he pulled the plug out, trying to kill de Gaulle. And it's really quite miraculous that he didn't actually get away with it in the end. And I don't know why that is, but he failed to kill de Gaulle. But the fact that he wanted to tells us that he would have no compunction at all about killing the United States of America, whom he once described as no kind of war hero, just a patrol boat captain who bobbed about in the sea somewhere.
Wow, unbelievable. And, well, you know, I want to get back to more of the evidence that we have that Gladio did indeed exist. You know, the highest levels of the Italian government, for example, they have gone public admitting that Operation Gladio targeted innocent civilians. November 2nd, 1990, the European Parliament had a resolution condemning the activities of Operation Gladio. Then there's the former Italian intelligence chief. He has come clean concerning Gladio. So, you know, many other countries have also declassified documents. So it is part of the public record. The United States government, along with other Western governments, deliberately targeted innocent civilians. They targeted trains, bus stations, schools. They killed innocent children in order to get the public to relinquish their liberties. And, you know, I know this is hard for a lot of people to believe. I wish it wasn't true, but we got to face the facts. We got to deal with it. And what about you, Richard? Do you find that a lot of people have a hard time accepting this?
Oh, absolutely. By the way, you mentioned the European Parliament just now. I'm myself a former member of the European Parliament.
That's right, yeah.
And I'm coming in for a lot of stick because I was a conservative, and for a conservative European MP to take this approach towards NATO, shall we say, slightly unusual. Yes, I think the problem is that people are closing their minds and they too easily believe that good is good. By this, I mean that the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is like the Salvation Army, or some sort of organization of this kind. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization is an offspring of the military-industrial complex. It needs to survive. In order to survive, it has to manufacture fears and risks. And this is why, this is a point that I want to make fairly quickly now, this is why Gladio, which is a trademark and a brand, is continuing. We're not talking about history here. We're talking about something which is happening, even as we are sitting here having this discussion now. This is what I call Newtonian terrorism. One reaction is intended to cause another equal and opposite reaction. You stage a terrorist event, and so you convince people that it must be real. These people really did blow up the underground trains in London and Madrid and wherever else. But the real evidence points to the hands of public authorities in this affair.
Well, absolutely.
And of Pakistanis with some chemicals amounting to little more than fireworks, which they could have bought in Boots the chemist.
What were some of the worst terrorist attacks that were carried out, the worst terror attacks on record that were carried out by Gladio?
Well, it depends what you mean by worst terrorist attacks. I mean, there were selective assassinations, for example, of Aldo Moro, the former Italian prime minister, who had the temerity to propose a compact between the Christian Democrats and the communists, the so-called historic compromise. He died not long afterwards. He was snatched from his car on the way to Parliament to propose that the Italians should bury the hatchet and try to come together and form some kind of consensus government which would last for the future. He was murdered for this purpose. The so-called Brigati Rosse, the Red Brigades, were blamed for this. It was nothing to do with them at all. This was a crime caused by Western intelligence in cohorts with NATO, with neo-Nazis, and a Roman criminal gang. I don't mean Roman criminal gang of the past. I mean the one that was living around in Rome at that time. And this is very interesting because it once again shows the historiography here that Gladio always will work with extremist organizations, always neo-Nazis, and they have no compunction at all about working with the mafia and criminals.
Well, and we've been showing some video, I've noticed, about the Bologna massacre that occurred on August 2nd, 1980. Bomb went off in the central station of Italy, which, I guess it killed 85 people, wounded more than 200. And it was so horrific that it caused certain members of the Italian officials to break their silence on this and expose the operation. What are some of the more prominent public figures who have come forward to expose this?
Well, I'm sorry to say relatively few.
I can imagine.
To speak of Bologna for a moment, this was immediately blamed by Francesco Cossiga, who was the president of Italy at the time, on the Red Brigades. Now, as the president of Italy, he had formerly been one of the founders of the Gladio secret army. This story didn't last 24 hours before it was discovered that the bomb had been planted by a right-wing political force, underground political force, with strong ties to Italian and Western intelligence quarters. And the object of the exercise was, as usual, to terrify Italians with the idea, the notion that the terror was in their midst. It wasn't something distant or far away, but there were evil people surrounding them in their daily lives who would create awful atrocities of this kind. In fact, it was performed by a bunch of neo-fascists.
Well, again, you know, there's been a total media blackout on this subject in the United States. In fact, you know, I know that the BBC, they produced a documentary about Gladio in the early 1990s that never aired in the United States. In fact, we were unable to purchase the DVD. Google even blocked the video on the internet. So, you know, it's very tough to access this information. However, at the same time, you know, word is still getting out. Thankfully for people like you who are writing books about this, other whistleblowers. And the other night, Alex Jones on national television on CNN, the Piers Morgan show, well, he talked about Gladio on CNN. Let's take a look at that clip.
Who do you believe is behind it?
I have the proof. I heard them on CBS Radio.
Who, Alex?
They announced they blew up the towers on CBS Radio.
Who do you believe?
New Yorkers all saw it and heard it.
Alex, who do you believe?
They blew up Building 7.
Alex, who do you believe was behind it? The American government?
Criminal elements of the military-industrial complex, the same ones that staged Gulf of Tonkin, the same ones that staged the mass shootings of Operation Gladio.
Right.
Ooh, the CIA don't like this now.
And of course, since then, Alex has been subjected to much ridicule and demonization for his comments on CNN. And, you know, that reminds me, you know, what is the political climate like in Europe? Are people able to freely talk about this? Is this an open discussion in the media, or are you experiencing the same blackout there?
Absolutely. Gladio here is something which is widely discussed, particularly in this country, of course, because we hold the copyright on it through the name of the Italian branch of the NATO secret army organization. But you speak of Americans not knowing things. I will tell you something else which is very interesting. We have a real live Ergenekon organization, which is Gladio in Turkey. This is a secret deep state organization, Derin Devlet in Turkish, which has been plotting to overthrow successive Turkish governments for many years now, and quite often succeeding and pulling it off. Now, this organization has been dragged into the public glare as though the wreck of the Titanic had been pulled up from the bottom of the Atlantic and found to be in full working order. It's an exact replica of Gladio. Now, what does this tell us? It tells us that Gladio is active, alive, working and plotting to this day. It is behind terrorist atrocities which have been performed in Europe, not 20, 30, 40 years ago, but which have been performed within, shall we say, minutes in the historical record. This is the important thing to remember. All the time we keep talking about Gladio as something that happened in the past. It's a long time ago. Maybe we should bury it now. It's all forgotten. It's history. It's not. This is an organization or an idea or brand or trademark, call it what you like, which is so useful you cannot put it away.
Well, and I was taking a look at your book, and you wrote in your book, Gladio, the political system of the United States has a deceiving democratic and legal appearance on the surface, but in reality is now little different from any other dictatorial regime in the world. And you also said that the Gladio technique of undermining the state from within is far from over.
Yeah, absolutely. We see it here, unfortunately, in Italy quite regularly. We had the destruction of the underground trains in London, and the year before that, the atrocities performed upon the Madrid railway system. We had the long series of tragedies in Germany, the long German autumn as it was called, in which many atrocities attributed to the Baader-Meinhof gang were in fact conspired and organized by Western intelligence. And let me tell you another trick which goes on here. Most people will know of the Baader-Meinhof gang, for example, and they probably may have heard, even in America, of the Red Brigades here in Italy.
Sure.
What they don't know is that these organizations were manipulated and controlled by Western intelligence. In other words, you've got a sleeper planted inside, shall we say, the Red Brigades, who would steer the Red Brigades into performing horrific and terrible acts. The Western intelligence sleepers would also tell the authorities what these gangs were up to. And, of course, the Western authorities but simply sit on their hands and look the other way and wait to reap the propaganda harvest. One thing we haven't mentioned yet, which is perhaps the headline episode of Gladio-type terrorism here in Italy, was the attack on Pope Paul John II. Now, as you say, you read my book, so you'll see what my conclusion there is. This was nothing whatsoever to do with the KGB. It was nothing whatsoever to do with the poor little Bulgarians. It was actually a conspiracy in order to show the KGB in the worst possible light, the Russians in the worst possible light, capable of killing one of their own, a Slav, of course, because Pope John Paul was Polish, a Slav, for simple propaganda gains in order to continue the Cold War.
Well, and that makes me think of the mass shootings. I'm sure that you're aware of the mass shootings here recently in the United States, and there are a lot of discrepancies and bizarre accounts in both, you know, the movie theater shooting in Aurora, Colorado, and the Sandy Hook massacre in Connecticut. And I believe there is strong evidence that support a possible false flag event in both of those tragedies. We certainly know from history that our government is purely capable enough and evil enough to pull something like that off in order to take away even more of our liberties. And as you know, the Obama administration and the controlled media is pushing for strict gun control as a result of the shootings. Now, do you think that they are barbaric enough to kill innocent children as an excuse to attack our Second Amendment?
Yes. Will that do?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, straightforward, and you and me both. And, well, I agree with you. And, I think that this book, Gladio, is instrumental in waking people up. It is an excellent read, and you are certainly a gifted writer. I highly recommend that people out there pick it up and read it because, it contains a wealth of information on not just only the series of savage terror attacks by NATO and the CIA in Europe during the last half of the 20th century, but it also includes insight on modern-day terrorism, what we were just talking about, and it is escalating, and it is carried out by the same corrupted individuals. Am I right?
Yeah. Well, think of the event on Utøya Island in Norway. Yeah. Possibly the worst Gladio-type massacre of recent times. I've no doubt that the alleged perpetrator, Breivik, is a patsy. This is something we also have to mention here, that in any Gladio terrorism, you must always come up with a patsy. These are the people that you can blame. If necessary, bring them up in court, stage show trials.
Or kill them.
You can prove to people that these folk really were responsible for these terrible deeds. It's always a patsy. There's always a Lee Harvey Oswald in this somewhere. A man with an ancient rifle sitting at the top of the Texas book depository can hit President Kennedy from an angle which I think even skilled sharpshooters would find very difficult indeed. So always you can find that intelligence organizations will find the patsies that they need in order to create the diversions which can then reap the harvest in turn of, as you say, culling our personal liberties, destroying our democratic societies, and continuing the warlike menace to our societies as a whole.
Well, and that's because it works every time, but fortunately there is a mass awakening going on right now, so, more and more people are learning about this. And, we're almost out of time. I want to thank you once again for joining us. Any last thoughts before we go?
Well, what I found really in writing this book and talking to people and introducing them to the idea was a general mood of complacency. A lot of people would accept that what I was saying was correct, that I had produced the evidence and that it was overwhelming and condemning. But then you get the hands in the air thing. What can we do about it? This brings you to ask yourself, all of us, no matter where we live, how much can we trust the governments that we elect? How much can you trust the Congress of the United States of America? How much can the people of this country trust their parliament? Not very much. It's got 7% approval at the moment in the latest opinion poll. We have to change our attitudes away from militarism. This is basically the cause of all our problems.
Well, you know, and that's the thing. And you say that 7% approval rating. When are people going to wake up? Because 7% approval rating, yet the same politicians keep getting elected back into office.
It's a charm circle, isn't it?
Yeah, it's crazy.
They pay huge amounts of money, so they have every reason to continue the circus. I mean, we're watching the spectacle now of the tired old guy Berlusconi trying to become prime minister for the 4th time. There is some sign that this is not playing to the gallery of public opinion quite as he thought it would. He's a tired old guy who chases young underage girls. But the fact that he is still in the race, the fact that he can still run for office in this country, tells you what is wrong.
Well, that's right. Well, Richard Cottrell, we certainly appreciate your time. Hope to have you back on the program in the near future. Thank you for joining us today. All right, folks. Well, that was definitely an interesting conversation. Hey, don't forget that Gladio is available right now at InfoWarsShop.com, so I would highly recommend it. It's a great read. If you scan through my book, you can see I've got notes throughout the entire book. Look at this, Marcos. When I mark something up like this, that means that it's a good read, all right? Look at this. Boom, boom. Talks about the strategy of tension. He calls the United States the glorious Republic of Pentagonia. And anyway, it goes through, you know, it talks about the Kennedy assassination, modern-day terrorism. It's all in here. It's an excellent read, so definitely check it out. Hey, that's going to do it for tonight's program. The InfoWars Nightly News will return, Lord willing, next Monday through Friday, 7 o'clock p.m. Central Time, Texas time, that is. So until then, have a blessed weekend. We'll see you back right here on Monday. Good night.